So this topic is a little break from the diversity lectures, just to renew a little bit of information about kind of behind the scenes how these classification processes work, and something maybe a little more practical skill set that you might encounter if you're investigating plant species diversity, or definitely comes up kind of a nice perspective to have as you're trying to identify plants. So big focus on diversity, on variation, and we'll see how that kind of fits in. So just kind of a lovely picture to get us started, some plants and a nice forest understory here. So the topic is called morphometrics. And when we talk about morphometrics, this word is made up of morpho part and a metrics part. And we've talked about morphology. So this is basically morphology. And the morpho part is shape or form. And the metrics part is basically to measure or to count. So the emphasis here is on what kind of features of plants can you maybe put some numbers to, and how valuable are those numbers? It really depends on the context. So let's dive in here. So as I mentioned, the big theme of this topic is variation. So looking at members of the same species even, this is some herbarium sheets of the species Pyrola elliptica. And you can see there's some variation here. We've got individual plants have been collected, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those, and they're the same in some aspects, and they're different in some other aspects. And so when you're identifying a plant, we've talked about this before, you'll need to focus on the features that are consistently present in this species and consistently different from other species. But just looking at these images, you can see that we have differences in the number of leaves, even the number of flowering stalks on here. This could potentially be a couple of plants that got collected together. Different sizes of leaves. We don't have to measure them to see that maybe this is a little bit bigger over here than the ones on here. I think they're about at the same scale. Numbers of flowers, sizes of petals, things like that. There's a whole bunch of features you can put numbers to. And there are going to be some numbers that are more valuable and some that are maybe less valuable for telling plants apart. So for example, you might in this genus Pyrola find some measurements that you would always find basically the same across a lot of different species. Those aren't super useful for telling species apart. So when we talk about variation, there's variation within a species and variation between species. So a couple different species in this genus Pyrola, Pyrola acarifolia on the left, Pyrola elliptica on the right. And this is really where these differences become important for classification. So if you're trying to identify this species on the left as different from this species on the right, maybe you can just take a glance and it looks like the sizes of leaves are a little bit different, the shapes. You've got more elongate leaves in Pyrola elliptica. It's kind of built into the name, more elliptic leaves. This acarifolia is, folia means leaves, and acara means referring to the wild ginger plant. So leaves that are kind of like wild ginger. And in that respect, they're more lobed at the base. So just the presence of those lobes would be helpful maybe for identifying this species as different from the other, and then the overall shape. And then other features that are not immediately jumping out to us, but this is the kind of thing that a taxonomist would get in with a lot of different specimens and a lot of patient time trying to figure out what is consistently different about these. So there's going to be variation within the species, there's going to be variation within this species, but the differences between them are the ones that are really useful for identifying the different species. So even closer scale, on a finer scale, you can figure out that there are actually differences within an individual. So the same plant doesn't always produce exactly the same kind of leaf, for example. So this is a single plant, and they've grabbed leaves that are growing in the shade and leaves that are growing in the sun. And they see there's a significant difference in the size, the measurements of these leaves, the form of these leaves, the features they have, depending on where they're growing. So really, I guess the big picture here is that we account for these differences, and we don't assume that just because there's a difference that we're looking at a different species, for example. We see lots of these useful differences, as I mentioned, for telling different species apart. And this topic is zooming in a little bit more closely within a species. So sometimes there are species that have lower taxonomic categories that we'll focus on briefly here. So this is a taxonomic category called variety. So it's an official category. Variety is a group under the level of species. So these three different varieties that are listed here for this species, Ranunculus flammula, those are named categories. They have their own features, and depending, the use of variety is not always consistent, but depending on how these are used, you might see a variation in where they're located, and also they'd have their own morphological variation. So it kind of depends, depending on the taxonomist, how much you want to subdivide your categories to try and make sense of them. That's the real reason we have names, is like you can say that you have a name for a species or a variety, and it means something, like you know where to find them, you know how to identify them, and so on. So we've talked about the bigger categories. They're in bold here: family, genus, and species. And I don't focus too much on these in this class, but they might come up. They're useful depending on, largely depending, I'd say, on the size of the group you're looking at. So if you have a really big plant family, you might have important subfamilies within that family. If you have a large genus, it might be important to break it down into sections. Really, again, just categories that make sense. So if you can make sense out of some variation within the genus and put some groups in one section and some species in one section, some species in another section, if that's helpful to tell people to sort of classify these, categorize them, and feel like you know them better, then those names become useful. So for right now, looking at variation, the topic of variation within a species sometimes brings us to these named categories. So I mentioned variety, and I'll talk about these other ones. They are roughly ordered according to the size of the difference. So I'll give you kind of my take on these. It's already hard to define what a species is, and so there's some disagreement on what exactly a subspecies is, or variety or form. Like how different does it have to be to become one of these different categories? So I'll just give you kind of my take on this. The subspecies are often geographically separated, so different that they don't really stand a chance of being mixed up for one another. So consistent morphology differences, consistent geography differences. Varieties, maybe a little bit less of such a difference. So variety is sometimes a different kind of, maybe in a different geographic area, possibly due to the environment itself causing these plants to grow a little bit differently. Sometimes having a variety name on there is useful to be able to say, well, these things look different, but they both belong to the same species. Having the variety name allows you to say, well, what's different about them exactly? All right, and then form, this one I'd say is probably the least used and maybe the least useful. Sometimes you have a rather extreme kind of plant that's growing. I think this is probably the most common way to use this, growing in a different kind of habitat. So I'm familiar with forms that are named for plants that grow in the water. So you can have a plant that grows above water and it has a pretty identifiable set of features. And then that same plant, under some conditions, could be growing underwater. And then it looks really different. It's still the same species, and you wouldn't really identify it as such. So having this form named is a way to kind of identify what you have and still assign it to the bigger category of species.